The mind is not designed for thinking, and in fact, it's not very good at thinking. It tries to avoid thinking whenever it can. I'm Keith Sawyer, and this is the Science of Learning podcast, and I'm here with Dr. Daniel Willingham, a professor at the University of Virginia. Dan, welcome to the Science of Learning.
Thanks so much. Happy to be here.
What do you mean in your book, Why Students Don't Like School? What do you mean when you say people aren't very good at thinking?
What I mean is that thinking is really the last resort. And by thinking, I mean what cognitive psychologists would usually call high-level cognition. So decision-making, reasoning, problem-solving, and indeed the kinds of things that we are eager for students to do at school. It's really the last resort. Your brain is designed to save you from having to think rather than thinking being the first cognitive process of choice. And instead, what you want to do is rely on memory. In other words, when you're confronted with a situation where you size it up and like you need to act, you need to do something, or indeed just in the process of sizing up the situation, the first thing you do is consult memory to see whether you've been in a similar situation before. And if you have, what did you do and how did it turn out? And if the answers to those questions, and of course, all of this is happening in less than half a second, it's not a conscious, reflective process. But if you consult memory and find, I've been in this sort of situation before, I did this, and it turned out fine, like the outcome was fine, you're very likely to do the same thing again. And the reason for that is that when you think about it, we're constantly confronted with situations during our day where we could engage in problem solving, we could think creatively. So, I walk into my kitchen in the morning and I think to myself, I'd really love a cup of coffee now. There's actually lots of ways I could get coffee. Right? I could get in my car and I could go find a restaurant, or I could go to a gas station, or I could buy a new coffee pot, a different coffee pot than the one I have. I could wake my wife up and try to get her to make me coffee. I've got all these different ways that I could obtain a cup of coffee. But of course, I don't do that. I go to my pot. And again, now there's a sub-process. Okay, I've decided I'm going to use my coffee pot. How will I do it? Well, I usually put a paper filter in. But I could get creative. What would happen if I used a piece of printer paper instead of a paper filter that I usually use, right? I could contemplate all these different ways of using my coffee pot, but again, I don't. And the reason for that is that memory is very fast and very reliable. You pretty much know what you can predict what's going to happen, whereas problem solving is slow, it's effortful, and it's much chancier. When you try and solve a problem, you may not think of a good solution. You may not think of a solution at all. And so this is why I say your mind is set up to save you from having to think. Over evolutionary time, thinking is what you did when you were in trouble. What you wanted was mostly to know how to deal with your environment based on prior experience. And that lives on today. That's why we feel like we spend much of our day on autopilot, getting up, making coffee, showering, trundling onto work. We do all these repetitive, repeated actions on autopilot because that's the way our brains are set up.
Right? Routine, repetition, autopilot, sort of like the contrast between script and improvisation. My own research is studying improvisation. So it sounds like you're saying, if we can, we're going to follow the routines of our everyday lives. Most of our day is routine. Is that fair to say?
I think that's right, because most of what we do is what we mostly do, if you see what I mean. Like, most of our time is spent doing routine things. There's lots of that in our lives. And it's, I think I point this out in Why Do Students Like School? It's notable when you're in an environment where your routines don't work. And I think the easiest example of that is if you ever engage in any travel, and especially if you travel to a place where you don't know the language, then doing routine things, just figuring, like crossing a street can be adventurous because the signs are a little bit different. And, if you're in England, you've got to figure out which way do I look for oncoming traffic. And, when you go to buy a drink in the afternoon, the currency is different and the packaging on everything is so there's all of this stuff that is at home would be completely routine and you would rely on memory, and now it becomes a problem for you, problems to be solved. And that's why one of the reasons that travel is so exhausting. You're thinking all day.
Oh, yes. And I've done that, and it is exhausting.
Absolutely.
And so, yes, I never thought about it as thinking. It's because I'm thinking. So, and you draw all sorts of implications there for teaching and learning. So you say that's why students don't like school, because learning requires thinking. I guess that's how you'd put it, right?
Yeah. I mean, when you think about this as an educator, the implications do seem a little intimidating. It's like, so what I'm trying to get students to do all day is exactly what their mind is telling them to avoid. But there's another side to it, because people are curious, right? We've all heard a million times, curiosity is natural. Humans are naturally curious. And that's certainly true. But curiosity is also fragile, as we all experience, and those of us who are teachers see in the classroom. Sometimes you're curious, and frequently you're not very curious. And I think curiosity is widely misunderstood, and I don't think it's something that psychologists have really had their arms around until about the last 10 or 15 years. We typically think of curiosity as a sort of a natural desire to learn about your environment, which seems like what we see in other species. And many species, not every species, but many, many other species show curiosity. And that's expressed, it's easiest to see in species that are either foragers or predators, because if an ethologist is watching them, they have an individual animal have known hunting grounds or foraging grounds that it visits regularly. And if it gets the opportunity to visit some new location, it will do that. And it will forego the opportunity to visit a foraging ground that usually performs well for them, where they're usually successful, in order to explore something new. And so it looks very much like, okay, that seems like an obvious evolutionary advantage. If you always do, what you've done before, you'll never learn about something better. But gathering information about the environment is, when you think about it for just a moment, it's too limited a characterization of curiosity. Because when you think about it, the world is full of new information I might learn something about that I'm not curious about. If you offered me, Keith, a book to read about economic opportunities in growing mushrooms at home, that's got completely new information for me, and I would have absolutely no curiosity about that at all. So I'm not uniformly interested in learning about my environment. So I think the extra step, the key, is that what we're really interested in is not just acquiring knowledge, but actually understanding our environment. And I think the difference between knowing and understanding is knowledge that is going to be useful in a mental simulation. I think mental simulations are enormously important to us because and again, sort of thinking over evolutionary time, this is a huge advantage if you can know your environment well enough to the point that you can contemplate a new action, something that you haven't done. And instead of having to try out that action, you can simulate doing it and get a pretty accurate guess at what the outcome would be. There's a huge advantage to that. But knowledge is not enough to do that. And so the distinction between knowledge and understanding entails causality. You understand causal relationships among things. You don't just understand clusters of individual facts. So that's the other thing. Sorry, there's a long answer, but this is where you started with the reflection that we're not always interested. Why don't students like school? Because our minds want to be on autopilot. And I said, yeah, that's very true. But at the same time, we're curious. And so thinking that way does require sort of unpacking what really leads to curiosity.
Oh, there's so much in what you said. Speaking of unpacking, curiosity, knowledge, and understanding, I'd like to unpack all of those things. And I know knowledge runs through everything you've written. For you, that is the essence of learning. So say a little bit about that. What do you mean by knowledge, and why is that the core of learning?
Well, I think, yeah, there are certainly different types of knowledge, you can think of different depths of knowledge. So one would be familiarity, and familiarity meaning, and this is the way psychologists use this term, as you know, is pretty close to the way it's used in everyday conversation. It's knowing that you have encountered something before, but perhaps really having very little other information about it. So this is our experience when we're, in the grocery store and we see someone and we're like, that person is familiar. What we're saying is, I know I've seen that face before, but I can't tell you anything else about it. This is very relevant in education because it's easy to mistake for familiarity for some deeper knowledge. And students do that frequently, and they assess that, they self-assess. I'm ready for an exam. I really know all these vocabulary words, for example, but the vocabulary words are actually familiar, but they don't have deeper knowledge of them. And so that sort of brings us to the next type of knowledge, which I would call knowing. And knowing is having some basic information about it. So in the case of vocabulary word, it would be knowing the definition and being able to use it properly in context and so on. And then still deeper knowledge is understanding. And as I alluded to, I think the difference between knowing and understanding, causality plays a very important role. But then also things that we understand are embedded in a rich network of associations. So the example I give in the book I'm working on now is, imagine a 3 or 4 year old being told a whale is not a fish, a whale is actually a mammal. What does that mean to the child? There's not going to be much of a feeling of understanding because the child doesn't really know what a mammal is. And so now the child has knowledge, a whale is a mammal, but that fact is sort of a factoid that's isolated from any other knowledge. That new bit of knowledge, a whale is not a fish, a whale is a mammal, would land very differently if this child knew a lot of the qualities of mammals. If the child knew mammals are warm-blooded, mammals have lungs, mammals have hair, mammals give birth to live young. And part of the reason there would be this would feel so different to the child is it lends itself to inferencing, and it would lend itself to a lot of questions, like how, if whales breathe, then they're underwater. So how do they breathe underwater? And I need to think that through. And how does a live birth happen underwater, and so on. So that's the first thing to say about knowledge. And then, implicit in this also is, why is knowledge so important to thinking? And I imagine we'll get there as the conversation continues.
So it sounds like knowledge is the smaller pieces, the individual facts maybe, and then understanding are the conceptual networks that bring all those pieces of knowledge together. So it makes sense that when you have that network, you bring everything together, then you're going to remember it and you're going to understand it better.
Absolutely.
And you can't have understanding unless you have all the facts first, right? You've said you have to have the facts before you can have the understanding.
I think that's right. I mean, it's hard for me to see. Understanding is like, crudely, understanding is more. It's like it's harder to We all appreciate it's harder to understand stuff than it is to know it. Knowledge seems to come first, and yeah, as I said, this characterization of knowing and understanding, I think, gives us. It seems consistent with that idea that knowing comes first.
I read a recent article of yours on the internet where you're making an argument about teaching students how to read, where you say reading comprehension, there's a lot of evidence that it's enhanced if you know something about the content of what you're reading, that you can't just learn to read in some sort of abstract, skill-based way. Did I get that right? That knowledge of what you're reading, I mean, I don't know, it sounds kind of like obvious common sense. Were there people who disagreed with that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting way of framing the issue, is to ask whether there are people who disagree with it. In my experience, when you sort of dig into it a little bit, people don't disagree, but it's not something, or that certainly the implications of it are not very often attended to or raised in educational circles. So let's start by sort of being clear about what we mean about why knowledge is so important. One thing we can do is just appeal to intuition, and then we'll break it down a little bit and talk about why it happens. So the intuition part is, if you pick up a London newspaper and pick up the sports page and read an account of a cricket game, if you're an American, you're not going to know what's going on. You're just not going to understand it. And that's because you don't know anything about cricket, right? And so this is the part where when you point this out, it's like, look, your knowledge has got to be important. If you're an American, if you know even a little bit about baseball, you're probably fine reading an account of a baseball game in the newspaper. But the same is not true of cricket because you don't understand anything about that. Okay, why is that? The reason is that all communication, not just written communication, but spoken communication as well, omits important information. There's actually other reasons knowledge is important, but this is probably the most important. So let's emphasize this. Writers and speakers omit information that's actually essential for understanding the message. So in one of my books on reading, I gave this example. Trisha spilled her coffee. Dan jumped up to get a rag. So how does knowledge play into comprehending this? Well, the writer almost certainly intended for you to understand a causal relationship. It's not just Trisha spilled coffee, then Dan jumped up and got a rag. You're supposed to understand Dan jumped up to get a rag because Trisha spilled her coffee. And you're probably supposed to understand Dan's intentions. Dan is going to use that rag to clean up the spilled coffee. None of that is in the text. And so what the writer is expecting is that the reader already knows spilled coffee makes a mess, rags can clean a mess, people don't like messes. And the writer knows you, the reader, are going to bring that knowledge from memory to bear on this text and sort of complete the writer's intended message. And this is why, if you don't have that background knowledge, then you're not going to understand the writer's message. And so for me, knowing nothing about cricket, whoever writes for British newspapers about cricket, or in Pakistan or any of the other places where cricket is played and it's common knowledge, they're going to omit a bunch of stuff that I can't replace with knowledge because I don't have it. So that's why knowledge matters so much. Now, some of the implications are that it's not totally appropriate to think about reading as this abstract skill. Abstract meaning doesn't matter what the text is. You have a reading skill, a reading comprehension skill, and that's how good a reader you are. And notice this is the way we're frequently encouraged to think about reading. For example, when a child takes a reading test, child gets a score on the reading test, and it's not offered for interpretation as this is how good a reader the child is on the 5 passages that appeared on the reading test. We're supposed to take that as this is how good a reader the child is for any passage. But we know from other data that's not true. Like how well the child can read really does depend on what they know about the topic that the passage is about. Now, there are some abstract reading skills that you can carry with you from text to text, and we can talk about that if you want. I think they're mostly less important than the knowledge bit.
Right. In this case, when you're talking about knowledge of cricket or knowledge, it seems different from the knowledge we were talking about a few minutes ago. We were talking about knowledge as memorizing small facts, but now you're talking about knowledge as a pretty big, complicated things like how cricket works.
It could be, but it could be small facts as well, right? It could be just an amalgamation of a lot of facts, and I think a lot of this does depend on the level of expertise expected in the audience. So what the author was thinking about. I think when it's a story that is written for, say, a third grader or something, almost all third graders are familiar with narrative form. So understanding sort of what the likely causal structure is supposed to be, there's going to be a main character, they're going to have a goal, there are going to be obstacles to the goal and all that. Most third graders are going to know that. And the knowledge that they have or might be missing may be pretty isolated facts. Whereas when it's, a technical journal of the sort that you or I would read, the information that's omitted is going to be very complex, interlocking systems of knowledge.
All right. So the implications for learning and teaching of this view, the implications would be that you would start teaching knowledge first, and then you'd move up to understanding. Is that right?
Well, I think not. Knowledge first is sort of inevitable, as I said, when compared to understanding. Understanding is always going to come. You always walk before you can run. But it certainly implies being very intentional about the knowledge that children are exposed to and children have an opportunity to learn. If you think of knowledge building on knowledge, then I want to, if I'm a third grade teacher, I kind of want to know what my children have learned in second grade so I can systematically build on that. And then, this is the idea of curriculum as a set of promises one teacher makes to the next year's teacher. I, as the third grade teacher, want to be sure that my children learn whatever it is the fourth grade teacher is expecting in terms of knowledge as well. And I mean, the easiest vision for me is I'm a third grade teacher and I'm setting a text down in front of a child. I want to know that they have most of the background knowledge they need in order to comprehend that text. Maybe missing some, they need to reach a little bit, but the curriculum has included most of the knowledge they need. So yeah, I think there are important implications in terms of the content of the curriculum.
So I want to go back to this idea of thinking. So how do we get to thinking? A lot of learning scientists and a lot of education researchers will talk about teaching students how to think, or even how to think like a scientist. Yeah. And, there'll be research about the nature of science, or teaching scientific inquiry, which would be like the mindset of a scientist. Like scientists are inquiring about the world. We're exploring the world. We're trying to solve problems in a scientific way. We make hypotheses. So it sounds like you're criticizing that way of teaching science, but you don't do that explicitly in your book, but it's kind of indirect. Are you critical of that approach to science education?
I'm not. But I am. I would be critical of thinking it can do more than it can do. So there's science education is a great example, because science education, it's kind of clear where the dividing line is. Like on the one hand, we want children to learn about things that scientists have discovered. We want them to know, the laws of gravity and principles of evolution and so on. But then we also want them to know how science is done. And to that's all the sorts of things that you were talking about. I absolutely think that should be taught explicitly. These are basically metacognitive principles. It's like I'm doing science now, and so this is the way I'm supposed to think about it. But it's not hard to appreciate the domain specificity of those principles. In other words, it's one thing to know those principles and to be able to, say back on a test what those principles are. It's another thing to be able to use them. And using principles, a principle like that I would, teach my graduate students, like you need to be sure that your data analytic methods are appropriate to the type of data that you've collected. That's an important principle. I want them to know it. But using that principle means you need to know a whole lot about data and about data analytic methods and so on. And I think the easiest way to appreciate the domain specificity is, I'll use myself as an example. I have been doing science for, close to 40 years now, and that includes, teaching undergraduates and graduate students in methodology courses and evaluating the work of other scientists and so on. And so when the science is in my domain in cognitive psychology, I think I'm okay at it. I can go next door to the chemistry building, and all of a sudden my knowledge, I can't use it. Now I can attend a talk there, and I can still, parrot what's supposed to be happening. I can, shout out at the speaker, "Hey, your data analytic methods better be appropriate to your type of data." But I don't really know how that cashes out in chemistry because I don't know enough chemistry.
A lot of how you wrote about that in your book really did resonate for me, although it made me think hard about it, because I would say I'm an advocate of learning how to think. And it was chapter 6 of your book, Why Don't Students Like School, that you basically say students, it's too hard to expect students to think like scientists because scientists simply know a lot more. They know how to think abstractly. They have a deeper conceptual understanding. So students just can't think that way. So if you expect them to, I guess you'd say they're just going to get frustrated and fail at it, I suppose.
I think students get frustrated less frequently than educators pretend students are doing more than they are. And when I press on this a little bit, I'm maybe caricaturing things to make a point. Teachers will say, like, "Look, yes, I understand. I don't have Linus Pauling in front of me. My expectations are in check, but I want them to do what is age appropriate." And no argument. That's most of what we do in education is we're trying. We sort of have this end goal in mind, and they're doing smaller versions of what the end goal is. And so, in the same way, like to me, it totally makes sense for fifth graders to write poems. Is it going to be great poetry? Probably not, right? And so to me, it's the same thing. It's like, should fifth graders be doing science? Sure, that's fine. They're not really going to be doing science the way a scientist does. And so to me, it just makes it seems so self-evident that youngsters should be doing, sort of what adults do, very high level thinking tasks. And I'm like, that seems appropriate to me, but like, think for a moment, because they're actually not doing what the adult is doing. So what are they doing? And what is our goal in asking them to do that?
Right. And perhaps, I don't know, what would be the goal of that sort of education? Should we expect them to learn a certain kind of thinking or deeper conceptual understanding? Because this is a lot of what you write about are these different kinds of knowledge. I guess knowledge being the lower level, and then there's understanding. And then you talk a lot about how do you get from this kind of knowledge to abstraction, because we want students to get to that more abstract level where we can generalize and we can transfer. So how do we do that? How do we get learners to get to that more useful abstract level of understanding?
So I'll I'll start by saying I don't think, by having them write poems, or, you don't understand, it probably actually would help a lot to understand the abstraction of a sonnet by actually writing a sonnet. In general, though, I think one of the reasons to write poetry or to, have science fairs is not because you think the resulting poems are going to be fabulous and the scientific experiments are going to be, correctly done and informative. But I think you can see some of the principles in action. It's a big investment on the part of the teacher and the student, but it can help get some of these concepts to land. I also think it's important for motivation. Just sort of like loading in knowledge and loading in, thinking processes for an entire school day. It's a lot, right? We started off this conversation talking about the fact that all of us have minds that would rather take a shortcut than do really hard things. And so there needs to be variety through the school day. And so I think something that is has motivation, lets students sort of see themselves as like, oh, I can, science is not so crazy. Like I'm actually kind of doing it here. I think there's value in that, even if you're not like enriching understanding in a deep way at that moment. Now, in terms of enriching understanding, one of the principles that I talk about in Why Don't Students Like School, there are lots of things that help memory, that make it more likely you'll remember things. But there's one principle in particular that I think is really important, which is basically whatever it is that you think about, that's what you're going to remember. And I phrase that as memory is the residue of thought. That's the most important predictor of what you're going to remember later, is how you thought about that experience. And so when you're trying to help students understand a concept, something abstract, what you need to think about is, how am I going to get them to think about that abstraction? And there are a couple of techniques that have been shown to be pretty effective. Dedrick Gentner came up with one of the best, which is problem comparison. So if you have, think about a principle of maths, and kids learn how to do a standard type of a problem with a standard type of an algorithm. One of the things you'll most commonly encounter is that nevertheless they have trouble when it's not expressed as an equation, but rather in a word problem. They can't recognize the underlying principle when it's in a word problem. So what Gentner had people do is compare word problems. So when you compare two problems, so one problem might be about, kids selling candy to fund a trip that their band is going to take. And then another problem is about, a tire dealership running a sale or some darn thing. And so the surface version of the problems are quite different. The band and so forth, and the tires, that's the surface. But then the underlying structure of the problem is the same. It requires this algorithm that kids have learned. So when you ask kids to compare it, what they have in common is what you're trying to get them to think about, which is getting to the underlying structure of the problem. This is one example of a way to sort of hurry this process of getting to deeper thinking.
That sounds fascinating. Is this a way of teaching that you see being used? Do you find that it's effective? One of the things, as that's very frustrating about being in American education is you have no idea what's happening in classrooms around the country, right? We just have terrible data on that. This technique has been around for probably 15 years or more, and I've written about it and others have written about it. I hope people are using it. Right. So, can you give an example of a school where people are following the principles of cognitive psychology that you're familiar with, where you think it's being done really well?
Yeah, I'm asked that a lot, and I don't have a school I have talked with schools where, school leadership has said, like, yes, this is something that we're working on. We're trying to. I don't know a school where anyone has said, like, please use us as an example and tell everybody that this is what we're doing and we're all in on this. And I make it sound a little bit like I'm keeping. There are some, and I'm keeping them a secret. That's not really what I mean to imply. It's more like, I hear about people doing stuff, but nobody who's like trying to like run with the flag and be the leader. Everybody follow us.
Right. Yeah. In your book, well, this was 2009. Why don't students like school? You don't have a whole lot of case studies.
Yeah.
In the book, like some books like that, there'll be like a box on a page saying this school in Kansas City did
right.
X, Y, and Z. So not so much like that.
That's right. Yeah. And there's actually a new edition, 2021, and I still don't have that. And that's kind of a nice idea. And maybe I should, if there's ever a third edition, maybe I should think about that.
Right. Right. But I think maybe because there's so much of your book that I think it's practically useful for specific teachers, things that they can do and things that they can use in their classrooms, say for a day or a week, maybe not so much that a principal would use to design an entire year. So maybe can you give us an example of something a teacher could do in their book? Or would you say it's more the kind of book that a student would use?
Why Don't Students Like School is definitely a book for educators. And a lot of, school leadership likes it just to sort of like have in their head, that they're always trying to stay up on classroom practice, I guess. But yes, you're right. It's definitely directed at classroom teachers, and all the examples at the end of the chapter of like, so each chapter describes a cognitive principle. And then at the end, it's like, here's how you could think about this principle, maybe applying in your classroom. I've just given one example of problem comparison as a way of getting at deeper conceptual trying to help students achieve a deeper conceptual understanding. Is that the kind of thing you were asking about?
Right. Yeah. So if you're a teacher or listening to this podcast right now, what could you do? Well, now, what could you do this fall?
Yeah.
Right now it's the summer.
And I'm actually asked not infrequently, so cognitive psychology has implications for education. If you had to point to one thing from cognitive psychology as the most important, what would it be? And the thing I usually say is I think memory is the residue of thought is probably the most important because, if students don't remember, it's kind of game over. And it's also game over if students aren't paying attention, but I don't think cognitive psychologists have anything very useful to tell teachers about how to get kids to pay attention. I think that is really more, teacher knowledge is going to be more important than lab knowledge. But the way memory works is something we know something about that's not super intuitive. So in terms of practical implications, I've actually suggested, I think this is important enough that I would use this as a lens for like pretty much every lesson plan. It's certainly, I do this in my own teaching at the college level. And what I mean by that is a lot of times I'll slip into, for a part of a lesson, I'm like, okay, and at this point, they're going to be thinking this. And that's basically what I hope they're going to be thinking. And I'm not always that realistic about whatever it is, like an example I've given them, or like it's going to be a turn in talk, or I ask them to write something down. Like, it's always, I assume their thinking is going to go in just the direction that I want it to. But this memory is the residue of thought is such an important principle. I encourage educators, think about what this is likely to make them think about realistically. Could their thinking go in a different way that is not what you want them thinking about at that moment? So that's a very, very broad implication, I think, of that cognitive principle.
I want to ask something that is kind of a big switch from what's in your book and also your 2023 book. In my own most recent book, which is about how professors teach in schools of art and design, BFA and MFA programs, they don't lecture and students don't take notes. It's very much a studio model where the students are they're artists and the designers engaging in an apprenticeship model. So they are apprenticing to be professionals. So they genuinely are learning how to think like professionals. It's at a very high level. So as I was reading your book and you're talking about basically, third graders and fifth graders and they're novices. So no, they're not going to be thinking like adults. But I've been looking at 22-year-olds who really are apprenticing to think like experts, and they are not listening to lectures and they're not taking notes. So I was wondering, what does cognitive psychology have to say about, so I don't know, is that a bridge too far? Is there something cognitive psychology has to say about the studio model of learning to create?
Yeah, no, it certainly does, because this starts to feel more, especially when you're talking about studio art, this starts to have has a significant overlap with motor skill and also perceptual motor skills and also, cognitive skills where you're doing things. And there's been lots of work by cognitive psychologists in all those domains, and especially in the military where people are learning to fly planes and learning other things that look very much like skill. But the big difference is with a lot of that work, it does not get to the idea of creativity. So the sort of performance-based, you sometimes hear quoted, I guess it was maybe Miles Davis, who was talking about and he's not the only one who said this, the importance of sort of getting the basics down before you are going to be able to really branch out effectively. I mean, of course you can be creative before you have the basics, but this is a sentiment you hear not infrequently. The basics are really important. You need to be masters. And I think cognitive psychologists have a lot to say about that, the studio method, as it contributes to that. And then they also have things to say, as you know very well, about creativity, but less often in that context.
I think that's true of myself as a jazz pianist. I'll spend 15 minutes or 30 minutes every night when I play piano. I'll just do scales or octaves or absolutely before I even start trying to play a song. And I don't think that's unusual for a musician, exactly. And before you can even, start trying to do a solo or, just very what might seem like tedious. People will transcribe their own solo. They'll play it back and then they'll sit there. I mean, that could take hours just to transcribe by hand your own solo. So is that creativity? No, you're just transcribing your own solo. So there's a lot of technical and I think that fits right in with your book and your research. That could be your next book. So actually, you said you were working on another book. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. Yeah, I'm working on a book on high-level cognition. So knowing, understanding, reasoning, decision-making, problem-solving, creativity. Each of those is a section with 2 or 3 chapters in each section. And I've been working on this book a long time. This is, I'm finding it very complicated and difficult stuff to get my head around. But yeah, that's what I've been working on for quite a while and having a marvelous time.
Well, that sounds like a natural next step to me. Do you have a name yet? What's it called?
I don't have a tentative title yet, and I don't have a publisher yet. I'm still working on the proposal, actually. But I kind of what I've been doing is sort of figuring out how I would put all this stuff together so that I have what I hope will be something substantive to say about it. And a big theme in this book is that there's, in education, people talk a lot about critical thinking. And as you know, in cognitive psychology, that's no one uses that term. I mean, it's really a basket term. And the terms that I just use, sort of reasoning, problem solving, decision making, those are the terms that we use because those are seen as psychologically separable, as demanding different cognitive processes. And what I argue in this book is there's actually a fair amount of continuity, and knowledge is the foundation of everything. So knowledge contributes to understanding, which contributes to reasoning, which contributes to decision making, and so on. And so these processes are hierarchically organized.
Right. Processes or kinds of knowing, would you say?
Processes mostly. Yeah.
Right. And the first thing I'm thinking of is I just wrote a Substack post about Bloom's taxonomy. Mm-hmm. And we're talking about knowledge and understanding all the way. It seems like we've got the 6 levels, or how many levels are there in your book? How many chapters?
Yeah, there are 6. Yeah, but I would put it a little. I get you. Thank you for mentioning Bloom's taxonomy, because I'll need to be sure that it's not interpreted that way. Bloom's. If you end up thinking what Bloom's taxonomy means is, first you have to get the foundation. So first you have to know a bunch of stuff before you can start moving up. That I would argue is not the way you would want to treat education. Bloom's taxonomy, instead of being the usual pyramid shape, I think it would be much more fruitful to think of it as a cycle where one feeds into the next, but the high level cognition also feeds into knowledge.
Right. Well, you'll be happy to hear the title of my Substack post is that Bloom's pyramid is wrong.
All right. I love it. You know what you're getting, when you read that Substack.
Right. And I quote from Lauren Anderson, who was one of the first, not the first, saying, I can't believe people are misciting my 2018 book. It's not a pyramid. I never had a pyramid in my book.
Yeah.
I don't know where the pyramid came from.
Right. As you know, there are... That's not the only one in education, the only myth that has just sort of popped up and been accepted that way.
Right. So what would you say to everyone listening? What is something everyone needs to know about learning that they can take with them from your research?
I think the most important thing is to recognize that your own insights into your learning process are not reliable. They're not wholly wrong, but we make mistakes every step along the way. When we try to control our learning, most of us don't know how to do that very well. When we try to assess whether or not we've learned something, most of us don't know how to do that very well. But the good news is researchers have figured out things that are under your control, things that you can do to make your learning more efficient and to more reliably test whether or not you know something. So the one thing that I want people to carry away with them is really an invitation to learn a whole lot more, because there are lots of these little tricks that can help you out. And we've reviewed a couple in the last hour.
Well, this is the Science of Learning podcast, and I'm Keith Sawyer. If you've enjoyed this conversation, I hope you'll like and leave a comment, subscribe to the channel. And Professor Dan Willingham, thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
That was a great conversation with Dan Willingham. If you enjoyed the conversation, I hope you'll subscribe to the Science of Learning.